In early June of 2025, the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles found itself at the epicenter of a national crisis. The city's streets, already simmering with tension over a series of aggressive federal immigration raids, erupted into protest. What began as demonstrations against the Trump administration's mass deportation policies quickly escalated. Clashes between protesters and local police became more frequent, and acts of vandalism, including the burning of self-driving Waymo vehicles, painted a picture of growing unrest. The situation was volatile, a complex mix of community anger, political frustration, and civil disobedience that captured the attention of the entire country, setting the stage for an unprecedented presidential action. Watching from Washington, D.C., President Donald Trump saw the events in Los Angeles not as local protests, but as a direct challenge to federal authority. He characterized the demonstrators in stark terms, labeling them insurrectionists and demanding swift, decisive action. For days, his social media posts grew more insistent, calling for the arrest of anyone wearing a mask to hide their identity and criticizing California's leadership for failing to control the situation. This rhetoric created a charged atmosphere, transforming a local law enforcement issue into a high-stakes confrontation between a state government and the White House, with the very fabric of American civil-military relations hanging in the balance. The breaking point arrived when President Trump, bypassing the state's leadership, ordered the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to the streets of Los Angeles. This was not a request for assistance from California's governor, but a direct command from the nation's chief executive. The stated mission for these troops was specific: to protect federal property and the federal agents carrying out immigration enforcement. However, their very presence, in uniform and under presidential orders, signified a dramatic escalation. It was a move that instantly raised profound questions about presidential power, states' rights, and the role of the military in domestic affairs. For the citizens of Los Angeles and for Americans across the nation, the sight of soldiers deployed in a major American city was both jarring and deeply concerning. It represented a crossing of a line that has rarely been approached in the country's history. The deployment ignited a firestorm of legal and political debate, pitting federal power against state sovereignty. Was this a necessary action to restore order and enforce federal law, as the president claimed? Or was it a dangerous power play designed to intimidate political opponents and set a new precedent for the use of military force against American citizens? The answers would have consequences far beyond the sun-drenched boulevards of LA. To justify his dramatic decision, President Trump did not turn to the most famous law governing military deployment at home, the Insurrection Act. Instead, his administration found its legal footing in a more obscure provision of the United States Code. The White House cited a section within Title 10, a part of federal law that deals with the armed forces. This specific clause gives the president the authority to use the National Guard to suppress what it calls the danger of a rebellion, or to help execute federal laws when the usual means are not enough. The order carefully suggested that the unrest in Los Angeles was heading towards such a rebellion, without officially declaring one. This legal strategy was seen by many as a clever and honestly alarming workaround. By avoiding the Insurrection Act, the administration sidestepped a term loaded with historical weight and political baggage. The Insurrection Act is a powerful tool, but invoking it is a clear and public declaration of a severe domestic crisis. The Title 10 provision, by contrast, is less known, and its boundaries are not as clearly defined by historical use. President Trump's legal team argued that the protests, particularly those targeting federal ICE agents, were actively preventing the execution of federal immigration law, thereby triggering the president's authority to intervene directly and forcefully. However, critics immediately pointed out that this justification was built on a very thin foundation. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum expressed deep concern, describing the rationale as flimsy and pretextual. They argued that the protests, while disruptive, did not rise to the level of a rebellion or an organized effort to overthrow the government. Instead, they saw the deployment as a politically motivated test case. The fear was that the administration was using the situation in Los Angeles to push the boundaries of executive power, establishing a new precedent that could be used against any state or city that resisted its policies. The administration's argument was that local and state officials were either unable or unwilling to protect federal law enforcement operations, leaving the president with no other choice. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt stated that the president has a sworn duty to see that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed, and that this duty superseded the objections of any governor. This set up a direct constitutional clash. It framed the deployment not as a peacekeeping mission, but as an enforcement action aimed at compelling a state to comply with the federal government's agenda, using the military as the instrument of that compulsion. The idea of using the military for domestic law enforcement has always made Americans uneasy. This discomfort is rooted deep in the nation's history and its founding principles. The colonists who fought the American Revolution were wary of the British Crown's use of soldiers to police them, a practice they saw as a tool of tyranny. This suspicion of a standing army being used against the people was written into the Constitution itself, which carefully divides power over the military between the President and Congress. The core principle was simple. Soldiers are for fighting foreign enemies, not for policing American citizens on American soil. This principle was formally turned into law after the Civil War with the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. The name sounds technical, but its meaning is straightforward. Posse comitatus is a Latin phrase meaning power of the county, referring to the traditional power of a sheriff to call upon civilians for help. The act makes it a federal crime to use the U.S. Army or Air Force for domestic law enforcement unless explicitly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. While the National Guard is a bit different because it has a dual state and federal role, the spirit of the act has always guided its use. Think of it like this. Your local police department is trained to de-escalate situations, protect individual rights, and operate within the civilian world. Their goal is to arrest a suspect who can then have their day in court. A soldier, on the other hand, is trained for combat. Their primary mission is to defeat an enemy using overwhelming force. Mixing these two roles is dangerous. Deploying military forces for policing tasks creates a risk of tragic mistakes and can make a tense situation much worse. It changes the dynamic from a police matter to a military occupation, which can erode public trust and escalate violence. Because of this long-standing tradition, deploying troops inside the United States is exceptionally rare and reserved for the most extreme emergencies. When it has happened, such as during the 1992 Los Angeles riots or after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it has almost always been done with the full cooperation and request of the state's governor. The governor, as the commander-in-chief of their state's National Guard, typically activates the troops. President Trump's action in 2025 broke sharply with this tradition, creating a direct conflict over who controls these forces and for what purpose they can be used. While President Trump chose a different legal path, the shadow of the Insurrection Act loomed large over the events in Los Angeles. This law, which dates back to 1807, is the main exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. It grants the president the extraordinary power to deploy active duty U.S. military or federalize the National Guard to suppress a rebellion, insurrection, or domestic violence if a state is unable or unwilling to control it. It is one of the most potent and most dangerous powers a president possesses, as it effectively allows them to use the military as a domestic police force. Invoking the Insurrection Act is a monumental step. Historically, it has been used in moments of profound national crisis. President Eisenhower used it in 1957 to send the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce school desegregation against the resistance of the state's governor. President George H.W. Bush used it during the 1992 Los Angeles riots to restore order after the city was overwhelmed by violence. In these cases, the law was used as a last resort when all other options for maintaining civil order or enforcing federal law had failed completely. The reason the Insurrection Act is so controversial is that it places immense power in the hands of one person. It allows the president to decide on their own that a situation has become so dire that the military must intervene. This raises fears of abuse. A president could, in theory, declare that political protests they disagree with constitute an insurrection and use the military to shut them down. This is why presidents have been so reluctant to use it. The political cost is high, and the act of invoking it signals that the country's civil institutions are on the verge of collapse. In the 2025 Los Angeles crisis, the Trump administration's decision not to invoke the Insurrection Act was significant. By using the Title X provision instead, they attempted to gain similar powers without taking the politically explosive step of declaring an official insurrection. However, the threat remained. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put 500 U.S. Marines at Camp Pendleton on high alert, ready to be deployed if the situation worsened. This was a clear signal that if the National Guard deployment was not enough, invoking the Insurrection Act was the next potential step on the ladder of escalation. The reaction from California's state leadership to President Trump's deployment order was one of immediate and unified outrage. Governor Gavin Newsom, who had explicitly refused to request or authorize the use of his state's National Guard, condemned the president's move in the strongest possible terms. He called the deployment an unlawful and authoritarian act, framing it as a politically motivated invasion of his state's sovereignty. In a press conference, Newsom accused the president of manufacturing a crisis to justify an alarming abuse of power, vowing to fight the order with every tool at his disposal. This was not just political theater, it was a fundamental clash over the principles of American federalism. The U.S. system is built on a careful balance of power between the federal government and the individual states. Governors are the chief executives of their states and the commanders-in-chief of their National Guard units when those units are not under federal orders. For a president to federalize a state's guard and deploy it within that same state against the express wishes of the governor is a move that strikes at the very heart of that balance. Governor Newsom argued that the president was treating California like an occupied territory rather than a partner in the union. The governor's words were quickly followed by legal action. On June 9, 2025, Governor Newsom and California Attorney General Rob Bonta announced they were filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration. The lawsuit alleged that the president's order violated the U.S. Constitution, specifically the clauses that protect state sovereignty. They argued that the conditions on the ground in Los Angeles did not meet the high legal standard required for such a drastic federal intervention. The legal battle was set to become a landmark case, testing the limits of presidential authority in the modern era. Local officials in Los Angeles echoed the governor's fury. Mayor Karen Bass described the arrival of federalized troops as a chaotic escalation that was more likely to provoke violence than to quell it. She called it a recipe for pandemonium, arguing that her police force was capable of handling the protests and that the presence of soldiers would only inflame tensions. The community was already on edge due to the ICE raids, and the sight of military vehicles on their streets deepened the sense of fear and anger, creating a more volatile and unpredictable environment for everyone. Beyond the heated political rhetoric, legal and national security experts began to dissect the president's actions, and honestly, their conclusions were deeply unsettling. The overwhelming consensus among constitutional law scholars was that the deployment was a dangerous overreach of executive authority. They pointed out that while protests had involved vandalism and clashes, they did not represent an organized, armed rebellion that threatened to topple the government. Therefore, using a law designed to suppress a rebellion was, in their view, a distortion of its intended purpose. It looked less like a necessary security measure and more like a political power play. Many experts believed the deployment was a calculated test of how far the president could push his power, particularly against states with opposing political leadership. California, a populous and heavily Democratic state, has often been a focal point of resistance to President Trump's policies, especially on immigration and environmental issues. By sending troops to Los Angeles over the governor's objection, the president was sending a clear message. I can and will use the military to enforce my agenda, even within your borders and without your consent. This set a chilling precedent for future political disputes between the White House and state governments. The concern was not just about this single incident, but about the precedent it would set. If a president can deploy troops to a city because he disagrees with how local officials are handling a protest, what is to stop a future president from doing the same for any reason? Could a president send troops to a city to break up a labor strike or to shut down a political rally for the opposition party? These what-if scenarios, once confined to academic discussions, suddenly felt frighteningly possible. The guardrails of American democracy, experts warned, depend on leaders respecting unwritten norms and traditions, not just pushing a legal authority to its absolute limit. A smaller number of commentators, often aligned with the administration, argued that the president's actions were both legal and necessary. They claimed Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass had failed in their duty to maintain public order and were allowing lawlessness to prevail because of their political sympathies with the protesters. From this perspective, the president was not overstepping his bounds, but fulfilling his core constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. They argued that federal agents and property were under direct threat, and if local authorities would not act, the president had no choice but to do so. To understand just how unusual President Trump's action was, we must look at American history. Deploying a state's National Guard over the explicit objection of its governor is an incredibly rare event. In fact, before June 2025, it had not happened in 60 years. The last time a president took such a step was in 1965, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. President Lyndon B. Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard to protect activists led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as they marched from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. In that historical case, Alabama's Governor George Wallace was actively using his state's power to deny African American citizens their constitutional rights. President Johnson intervened to enforce federal law and protect those citizens from state-sanctioned violence. While controversial at the time, his action is now widely seen as a necessary use of presidential power to uphold the Constitution. The parallel to 2025 is stark because the motivations appear so different. In 1965, the military was used to protect protesters fighting for their civil rights. In 2025, the military was deployed against protesters who were themselves demonstrating against a federal policy. The more recent and more relevant comparison is to the 1992 Los Angeles riots. Following the acquittal of police officers in the beating of Rodney King, the city exploded in violence, looting, and arson. The situation quickly overwhelmed the Los Angeles Police Department. In that instance, California's Governor Pete Wilson formally requested federal assistance. President George H.W. Bush then authorized the deployment of both National Guard and active duty troops to help restore order. The key difference is that this was a cooperative effort between state and federal authorities, not a confrontation. It is also important to note a crucial change in the law that happened more recently. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, some in Washington felt the federal response was too slow because of disagreements with Louisiana's governor. In 2007, Congress passed a law that expanded the president's power, making it easier to deploy the Guard without a governor's consent. However, this move was met with unified opposition from all 50 state governors, who saw it as a dangerous federal power grab. In a rare display of bipartisan unity, they successfully lobbied Congress to repeal the law in 2008, restoring the older, more restrictive rules. President Trump's action in 2025 effectively ignored the spirit of that repeal. The deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles was deeply troubling, but for many observers, the most frightening part was what it could lead to next. The initial mission for the 2,000 troops was limited to guarding federal buildings and protecting ICE agents at their posts. However, the situation on the ground was fluid and unpredictable. National security experts warned of the high risk of mission creep, where the role of the troops could slowly expand beyond its original limited scope. What would happen if a protest outside a federal building turned violent? Would the Guard be ordered to disperse the crowd? The most immediate fear was that a confrontation between Guard members and protesters could spiral out of control. A single violent incident, whether accidental or intentional, could be used by the White House as a pretext for a much larger military response. The administration had already placed 500 active-duty Marines on standby. If President Trump declared that the National Guard was insufficient to handle the insurrection, he could then invoke the Insurrection Act and send in those Marines. This would represent a terrifying escalation, moving from a federalized guard to active-duty combat troops policing an American city. The rhetoric coming from the White House did nothing to calm these fears. President Trump continued to use inflammatory language, and he publicly endorsed the idea of arresting Governor Newsom for obstructing federal law enforcement. His hand-picked border czar, Tom Homan, issued a stark warning that any state or local officials who hindered federal immigration operations could face federal obstruction charges. This raised the specter of a constitutional crisis in which federal agents could be ordered to arrest elected state officials. This would be a move with no modern precedent, pushing the country into uncharted and dangerous territory. This potential for a cycle of escalation is what worried experts the most. A presidential action provokes protest. The protest is then used to justify a military deployment. The military presence then leads to more intense protests and potential clashes. Those clashes are then used to justify an even greater military intervention. This dangerous feedback loop could fundamentally alter the relationship between the American people and their government. It risked normalizing the use of military force to resolve political disputes, a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, not a healthy democracy. The laws governing this area were described by experts as unsettled and untested, and America was now testing them in real time. The deployment of National Guard troops to Los Angeles in June 2025 was more than just a response to a series of protests. It was a defining moment that forced a national conversation about the very nature of American democracy. The events brought fundamental questions to the forefront. Where does the power of the president end and the rights of a state begin? What is the proper role of the military in a free society? And how can a nation protect itself from the erosion of the democratic norms that have sustained it for more than 2 centuries? These are not abstract legal questions. They affect the freedom and safety of every citizen. The core issue at stake is the principle of civilian control and the tradition of keeping the military out of domestic politics. In a democracy, the power to police the people is entrusted to civilian authorities who are part of the community they serve. When a president unilaterally deploys soldiers to enforce a controversial policy against the will of local leaders, it blurs a critical line. It risks turning the military, an institution that is supposed to defend all Americans, into a tool for one political party or one president's agenda. This can damage public trust in the military and weaken the foundations of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. President Trump's actions in Los Angeles set a powerful and dangerous precedent. By using an obscure law to bypass a governor, he created a new playbook for expanding executive power. A future president, faced with political opposition or protests they dislike, can now point to this moment as justification for a similar or even more aggressive military response. This is how democratic norms unravel, not always in a single dramatic collapse, but through a series of small boundary-pushing actions that gradually become normalized. Each one makes the next more extreme step seem a little less shocking. Ultimately, why this matters is because the strength of American democracy depends on restraint, mutual respect between different levels of government, and a shared commitment to resolving disputes through political and legal processes, not through force. The sight of soldiers on American streets deployed to confront American citizens is a sign that this commitment is fraying. The crisis in Los Angeles serves as a stark warning. It reminds us that democracy is not a permanent state of being, but a fragile system that requires constant vigilance, active participation, and the courage to stand up for its core principles, especially when they are under threat.